This is The Shower's Return, a serial essay on the LGBT Title VII sex discrimination cases, Part 3. Hi, welcome back. I'm Marc Spindelman. I teach at The Ohio State University's Michael E. Moritz College of Law. I'm glad to be with you here today. As a reminder, the last talk left off with a description of the shower and locker room scene as it surfaced during oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court in Amy Stevens' Title VII sex discrimination case against her former employer, R.G. and G.R. Harris Funeral Homes, Inc. The shower and locker room scene surfaces as an important part of the defense mounted by John J. Bursch of the Alliance Defending Freedom against Stevens' legal claims. The shower and locker room scene appeared at the beginning, in different ways along the way, and again at the end of Bursch's oral argument. But the main portrayals of the shower and locker room scene bookended the case that Bursch made to the court. That's where I'll begin in a moment. First, a preliminary point about what I'm going to be doing in this talk before I get to doing it. Something that may be of a special interest for trans and pro-trans audiences. Some intense and intensely anti-trans positions were pitched directly and indirectly to the U.S. Supreme Court in both briefing and oral arguments in the LGBT Title VII sex discrimination cases. Some of these arguments, including some arguments by John Bursch of the Alliance Defending Freedom, representing Harris Funeral Homes, train their sights on trans bodies, specifically trans female bodies. In ways that will be detailed here, this focus on trans female bodies treats them in certain respects as signs and proper objects of various forms of institutionalized cis-heteronormative violence. These positions involved repeated misgenderings of trans people and negative portrayals of trans people as would-be criminal or criminal-like sexual injurers. Hearing these positions described in this video and in the ones that follow after it in the series may prove to be triggering, disorienting, and/or maddening, among other possible and highly understandable reactions. The purpose of documenting these anti-trans moves in their own terms and implications, building on positions staked out in the case, often by quoting language used at oral argument before the Supreme Court, is not in any way meant to validate them. To the contrary, it is to set the stage for a critique of these moves and the anti-trans positions they indicate. I have endeavored to spotlight where arguments are coming from as I proceed, sometimes quoting directly and sometimes more simply over-articulating quoted language, in order to indicate through my voice where I am quoting others. But there may still be places where who said what remains unclear. If you have any questions, I encourage you to refer to the published version of this work. It's available at no cost on the Ohio State Law Journal online webpage. I mention this here not simply to avoid needless misunderstanding, but also more fundamentally to recognize and to honor the full range of responsive realities that the text may precipitate, as well as, I hope, to clear some safer ground for encountering what follows. I trust you will anyway, but I encourage you to pause or stop the talk as you need to. Now, on to the talk itself. In important respects, the bookended versions of the shower and locker room scene that John Bursch sketches for the Supreme Court give and receive meaning from one another. Read together, Bursch's audience is supposed to know that gender identity, which is a broad concept, includes not only quote-unquote men who, he says, identify as women and who look and dress like women, but also male employees who identify as women but do not dress or look like them. It's these trans women, described by Bursch as not, quote, dressing as a woman, but looking like a man, unquote, who Bursch is going to be talking about. In context, Bursch's references to a trans woman looking like a quote-unquote man enables an allusion to the fact that Amy Stevens was only intending to have sex reassignment surgery at the time she was fired. Bursch's audience cannot possibly miss or fail to understand the point. Stated directly, Bursch's sketches involve a trans woman who has not had sex reassignment surgery, who, it is said, is showing up in the shower and locker room, not dressed as a woman, indeed not dressed at all, but, quote-unquote, looking like a man. Looking like a man in this setting carries double meaning. It's about being male in appearance or in look, as well as being capable of casting a male gaze. The leading meaning helps Bursch's normative audience, itself predominantly, if not exclusively, non-trans, not to mistake that this quote-unquote man who identifies as a woman is, in Bursch's description, a man in an embodied sense. From a pro-trans point of view, this kind of focus on the trans body is itself a very sure sign that a serious problem is afoot. A larger narrative involving this quote-unquote male employee who identifies as a woman, who shows up naked in the shower and locker room, emerges from situational clues that Bursch's minimalist sketching provides. Starting with the overnight shelter, Bursch identifies a place where women who have been raped, trafficked, and abused seek sanctuary. The women arrive at the overnight shelter post-trauma, likely post-traumatically, with injuries presumably inflicted by men, but only to find themselves meeting a counselor described by Bursch as a man who identifies as a woman, but who doesn't dress as a woman, but looks like a man. Within this fictional story, crossing the shelter's threshold means these women will be under this quote-unquote man's authority. Under the circumstances, submission to this quote-unquote male authority might be painful, even traumatizing, if these women are fleeing from abuses of socially male power that has injured them. Worse is in store. For this person Bursch represents as a quote-unquote man is about to abuse quote-unquote his authority and these women when quote-unquote he exercises the employment discrimination rights involved in the case, which Bursch says would afford the counselor the legal right to share the facilities, bathroom, shower, and locker room, with these recently injured women. If in this narrative it is unexceptionable that a trans counselor might wish to relieve herself during the workday, it's not at all apparent why she would want or ever need to be showering or in a locker room in a state of undress with her and the shelter's clients. How this conduct, if it were ever to come to pass, would sync with relevant licensure rules governing interactions between overnight shelter counselors when duly professionally licensed and shelter clients is not, of course, discussed. Nor did any justice inquire about it. In this story, what's important and what's mentioned is only that this counselor is there in the shower and locker room. So, there this counselor is, this quote-unquote man who, Bursch says, identifies as a woman, naked in the shower and locker room, looking like a man, while the women in that space are naked too. If the counselor's professional authority is coded quote-unquote male, as it may be, given how hierarchically arranged professional authority can and regularly does work, the central point here is that the counselor's authority is distinctively embodied. This authority isn't simply gendered quote-unquote male, it is also vitally sexualized that way, not least because of what's figured as the likeness of the counselor's body to the reasonably presumably male body or bodies that sexually harmed the women in the shelter through acts of rape, trafficking, and maybe abuse, itself regularly, though not necessarily definitionally, sexualized. These sexually injured women's bodies, facing the traumatic sight of what Bursch portrays as their quote-unquote male counselor and quote-unquote his body in the shower and locker room, makes this a scene of sexual injury from which the cis women are figured as hostage-like, powerless to escape. This account of the shower and locker room scene is clarified and extended in that other point on the restroom scenario Bursch offers to the court at the end of his oral argument. In this setting, the trans woman's quote-unquote male authority has nothing to do with any professionalized authority she may have, but is attributable strictly to how Bursch characterizes her as a female-identified male who has turned up naked once again in the ladies' shower and locker room. This quote-unquote male authority functions to type in Bursch's imagining, in classic male-dominant form, just like in the overnight shelter's shower and locker room scene. Quote-unquote he is situated over and above the women, quote-unquote he finds there. Women who, in this retelling, are not expressly identified as victims of or survivors of rape, trafficking, or abuse. Indeed, in producing this rendering of the restroom scenario, Bursch doesn't even quite get to saying cis women are in the shower or locker room with the trans woman he's describing being there. The toxic logic of this moment only partially corresponds to the notions of sex that the public originally understood in 1964, though sex here is in one sense basically binaristic. Men and women are the only two sexes, and everyone properly belongs either to one or the other, even if trans women are somehow figured as wishing to be on the other side of the sex divide, and so in a distinctive sense, straddling it. Sex is also biologistic in the scene in the sense that where anyone sits in relation to the sex difference divide is itself finally a matter of natural morphology and nothing else. At the same time, sex here is bound up with understandings of it that echo various ideologies of male dominance. It's the person identified as a quote-unquote man in this setting who possesses full control over the scene. It's the person identified as the quote-unquote man in this setting who's sexually dominating the women under quote-unquote his control. It's the person identified as the quote-unquote man in this setting who wills and decides what will happen to the women who are there. Man and woman here are both nouns, as well as the effects of embodied relational dynamics. They are who they are because of their bodies, and they become who they are because of who here is doing what to whom. These elements of male dominance inscribed on the trans female body are transphobic in no small part in virtue of their unmistakable and persistent misgenderings. They are also significantly transphobic in the related dramatic sense that the scenes, which entail a moral lesson about who trans women, or these trans women anyway, are, portray trans women who have not had sex reassignment surgery as villains akin to rapists, traffickers, and abusers, if distinctive from other quote-unquote men who do those bad things because they are sexual injuring hostage takers. Formally operating as part of the defense against the claims that anti-trans discrimination is sex discrimination, this transphobia is itself wholly sex-dependent. It involves a classic case of but-for sex discrimination, making it a spectacular failure as a valid, non-sex discriminatory argument ventured in the context of a Title VII sex discrimination proceeding. Recognize that this person depicted as a, quote, man who identifies as a woman, unquote, is a woman who identifies as a woman, and the shower and locker room scene collapses entirely as a problematic. The scene then becomes what, outside of its repeated representation as an inevitable scene of sexual abuse, it otherwise might have been imagined to be. Just another uneventful day in the ladies' shower and locker room, where women, cis and trans, shower and change and go on their way. Bursch's alternative offers a peephole into a sex-based, anti-trans dystopian nightmare that some cis men and cis women especially may find irresistibly and inalterably vexing, a call to arms in opposition to what is portrayed as trans criminality. Seen for what it is, the shower and locker room scene, its own normativities bound up with certain pornographic conventions, raises elemental questions about whose sexual investments it conforms to and satisfies. At the same time, and equally significantly, it is also deeply and conventionally sexist in its depictions of cis women. These women and their bodies exist in this imaginary space as helpless, just like the women and their bodies recently arrived at the overnight shelter after having been raped, trafficked, and abused by men. All cis women in this setting are eggshell vulnerable in a non-negotiable way, insofar as they're inevitably harmed by being in the inescapable presence of this trans woman misgendered as a quote-unquote man. Women here are imaginary figures with no independent interiority or subjectivity. Their bodies are conjured in the scene as fawn-like and pawn-like, strategically and fictively placed in close and confined proximity to a naked trans woman in the shower or locker room. In this fantasy, these hapless cis women witness the trans female body, and the way Bursch's depiction works is that the witnessing, itself perhaps suggestive of other, more horrific sexual possibilities that are also not directly spoken of, is itself so awful it constitutes its own phallically oriented sexual harm. Rape-like, trafficking-like, abuse-like. Bursch's normatively cis audience, first the Supreme Court justices, then others, is invited to make of these women their own marionettes, revealing them to be pure objects of individual and collective mental projection, serving as figures in a game in which trans rights and cis women's rights, trans desires and cis women's needs are set up as naturally antagonistic to one another, trans women being fictionalized as cis women's sexual enemies. The structure of this imaginary scene is unsurprisingly designed to turn at least the 5 conservative male justices against the pro-trans sex discrimination claims before the court, making the representation, however inaccurately, seem conventionally homosocial. One man, Bursch, triangulating with other men, the 5 conservative male justices, about what another person, figured by Bursch as a, quote, man who identifies as a woman, unquote, might do. The stakes here involve who will get and keep control over the bodies of vulnerable women. The impulses the scene is thus suited to trigger are romantic, chauvinistic, and protectionist. It offers cis men the chance to be the white knights who save these imaginary women in need of valiant men to save them from that other quote-unquote man's criminal acts. Bursch is arguing, of course, that that act of heroism can and should come just in the nick of time, in the form of an anti-trans ruling in the case by the U.S. Supreme Court. Nor is that all. The salvific impulses associated with romantic paternalism, readily mobilized against trans and gay interests, are also subject to being satisfied by a return to now widely discredited chauvinistic, sex protectionist logics that would counsel removing women from possible public zones of workplace danger altogether. Here, the sensibilities of the shower and locker room scene, although specifically a fantasy nightmare of trans female sex abuses of cis women, converges with the logics of separate spheres ideology that long and broadly kept women from coming under the authority of the wrong men in public and private spaces, barring them unfettered access to the public world of work on the same basic terms as men. Needless to say, a call for the reconstitution of separate spheres ideology, either in whole or in part, is not a tenable argument in a case involving the meaning of Title VII sex discrimination ban, itself a nail in separate spheres ideology's coffin. Unremarkably, Birch, having generated this thinking about the shower and locker room scene, declines to draw out its logic in ways that make the point overtly, which saves Birch from having to square it with the pro-cis woman protectionist vision of Title VII sex discrimination ban that his position maintains it involves. Just so, the logic of separate spheres that travels with the shower and locker room scene remains available as a rough template for a range of interpretive moves that would drain Title VII sex discrimination ban of its present-day content. It could do this maximally by making Title VII into the joke its House sponsors once had in mind for it to be, or, more modestly, as Birch's argument indicates, by tabbing the statutory prohibition on sex discrimination to the natural or biological differences between the sexes in ways that might soon take aim at sex-neutral workplace rules that themselves deny the distinctive natures of women and men rather than affirming them. A family values understanding of Title VII sex discrimination, its contours, and its relation to a new vision of home and work-life balance, elsewhere incipiently sketched, may thus be waiting in the wings. To be sure, for any of these changes to be viable, firmly established constitutional sex discrimination rules, widely favoring and requiring sex-equal and sex-neutral treatment of women and men, would have to be revisited. Without raising needless alarms, a Supreme Court decision embracing the shower and locker room scene as the basis for rejecting trans sex discrimination rights in Amy Stevens' case would not plunge us straight away back into a new version of the old world of separate spheres ideology. But then, it would at least be a step in that wrong direction. Turning the sexist urgency of the shower and locker room scene around and onto itself like this means to throw a wrench into how it otherwise leverages progressive, especially feminist and pro-feminist sensibilities as part of an effort to forge a conservative, liberal, progressive alliance in an anti-trans cause. In its different iterations, the scene may initially seem deeply pro-feminist. Witness all the care, concern, and solicitude rightly lavished on the needs of women who have been raped, trafficked, and abused. Needs that are then set in opposition to the actions of trans women represented as peculiar quote-unquote men who are criminal sexual injurers. Exposed as part of a regressive, sexist project that targets both trans women and cis women, it provides no real occasion on which, as it implies, good, decent, right, upstanding people must identify and pick sides. A pro-trans, pro-cis women, and anti-sexual violence politics is yet possible. People do it in different ways all the time. It's just that it's not available from within the logics of the shower and locker room scene as presented in this case. Still, the shower and locker room scene has real pull, including the power to generate a sense of dysphoria. This is Justice Sonia Sotomayor during an early exchange with David Cole of the American Civil Liberties Union, even before Birch's argument, though it comes after the briefing for Harris Funeral Homes that includes discussion of showers and locker rooms. At this moment, Justice Sotomayor is directing Cole's attention to the force of the bathroom scene in its conventional sense. The language is Justice Sotomayor's, so pay close attention and watch for the slip. Mr. Cole, let's not avoid the difficult issue, okay? You have a transgender person who rightly is identifying as a woman and wants to use the woman's bedroom. Rightly, wrongly, not a moral choice. But this is what they identify with. Their need is genuine. I'm accepting all of that, and they want to use the woman's bathroom. But there are other women who are made uncomfortable, and not merely uncomfortable, but who would feel intruded upon if someone who still had male characteristics walked into their bathroom. That's why we have different bathrooms. And what in the law will guide judges in balancing those things? That's really what I think the question is about. When a Supreme Court justice, accepting that the needs of trans women are genuine, lets loose a reference describing the woman's bathroom as the woman's bedroom, it may be time to ask if it's really only other women who are made uncomfortable, and not merely uncomfortable, but who would feel intruded upon if someone with quote-unquote male characteristics were to walk in on them in their bathroom. How would this point on the question the case is about look? How might it be expressed if instead of thinking about the woman's bathroom, the point had been made in the intensified way Birch would make it later on, where the bathroom scenario is about the women's shower and locker room? How would these other women Justice Sotomayor is talking about feel about a trans woman with what she refers to as quote-unquote male characteristics walking into their shower and locker room? Would these women find Birch's depiction of the shower and locker room scene very powerful, as Justice Sotomayor described his depiction of the overnight shelter after hearing him express it? Will the shower and locker room scene yet function as a basis for excluding trans women from certain jobs in certain workplaces? Critical perspective on the shower and locker room scene is imperative if one is to apprehend and, bearing witness, perhaps to seek to manage, if not to overcome, its triggering powers. Achieving this stance should also help frame an inquiry into what it is that is making it possible for trans women in this imaginary setting to be set up to take heat for sexual dangers that are not of their own devising, but rather reflections of the non-imaginary, very real-world material dangers that cis men regularly pose to women, both cis and trans. Why is the solution to cis male sexual violence stopping trans women from being who they are in traditionally women's spaces? Approached another way, the shower and locker room scene Birch advances may have the cultural purchase it does, despite the problematic romantic paternalisms it advances, because of how the scene taps into deeply entrenched cis male dominant ways of organizing social and sexual life and their violences. Modern, broadly sex-integrated, cis-female inclusive forms of public life in the United States have been a norm, after all, for what across history's vast sweep is only a brief moment of time. Even within this wider moment, trans inclusivity, indeed trans life itself, may at first blush seem to some to involve a rupture with sex-based rules built atop traditional ideas of sexual difference, which widely organize social, including sexual life, along with the social dangers that certain bodies need to be on guard against. No wonder other women, as Justice Sotomayor says, may experience aversive, even alarmed mind-body reactions upon simply hearing the shower and locker room scene described. Think of this restroom scenario, and it is still easy, culturally speaking, remarkably easy as Birch's arguments show, to raise specters of trans-inflicted sexual violence against cis women. The gesture is in fact so easy to make that an otherwise sympathetic justice can find herself understandably speaking the woman's bedroom when she means the woman's bathroom, and characterizing the argument from the overnight shelter as very powerful. Much as anything else, these positions reflect a cultural spirit. The ladies' bathroom, shower, and locker room are bedrooms in this culturally associative sense. At long last, and after tremendous, heroic effort, concerns about victims and survivors of sexual and/or domestic abuse are being widely recognized as very powerful too. These things being so, anyone, but being real about it, distinctively any cis-identified person, who dwells on the shower and locker room scene for long enough may still find themselves being animated toward a rage that can grip individuals as well as the country. Justice Sotomayor was assuredly accurately reporting the views of many cis women and cis men, some inclined toward pro-trans positions. The feelings are thus neither purely idiosyncratic nor strictly personal, though as attitudes about trans people and trans equality change, they may be moving in those directions. For the time being, they are in no small part about how we share a culturally and historically specific way of being, a social ontology that needs to be confronted if it is to be altered in both more sex equal and pro-trans ways. This social ontology, which the shower and locker room scene taps into, runs deep and is capable of surfacing at and through the level of reason. Unfortunately, on close inspection, that reason pervasively still entails the dehumanizing and marginalizing unreason of transphobia and sexism. This is why trans sex discrimination protections nested at these intersections are so necessary, but also partly why those protections may seem to so many to unsettle so much and to put so much on the line. Anti-trans logics are powerfully culturally resonant, a central part of what the Trans Equality Project, now fully joined within the wider LGBT equality movement, is up against in an elementary sense. Recognizing this may make it somewhat easier to apprehend how efficiently Bursch, via the merest of rhetorical gestures, could with so few words so quickly and repeatedly construct transphobic castles in the sky out of ladies' showers and locker rooms as a form of what some may experience as a decisive argument against any and all trans rights. At the level of non-transphobic reason, it should be deeply reassuring to those whose understanding is still evolving in relation to trans people and trans equality that Bursch had to concoct his case in the realm of narrative speculation. After a generation of trans sex equality cases, Bursch notably did not tell the Supreme Court at oral argument about one single actual instance as the basis for the shower and locker room scene he depicted, though there can be no real doubt that if he had found one, he would have told the court about it instead of relying on hypotheticals that he himself made up. Lacking one, Bursch's audience, prominently and specifically the Supreme Court, has no secure foundation for figuring an attack on a non-trans woman, indeed on any woman or anyone else, by a trans woman in a shower or locker room as a predicate for its decision in the case. To look ahead, it is regularly true, as the saying goes, it gets better. Sometimes, though, as with the arguments ventured in Stevens's case, it actually gets worse before it gets better. Thank you for your time and for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time for part 4 of The Shower's Return.